Okay, everyone? Hello and welcome. Hello to everyone who's joining us on Zoom and everyone in the room. My name is Trudy Collier. I'm one of the committee members for EdSign, and I'd like to welcome you all here to our EdSign event. This is the second we've had this year, and we're here at Deaf Action in Edinburgh. I do have some notes so that I don't forget anything. So we're in the Deaf Action bar. This is where you can see me standing. It's maybe a kind of yellow, white post-it. If you're in here live, that's an opportunity for you to note down your questions or any comments you might have that you want to make at the end of the presentation. So if you're here live, you can write down your questions and comments. If you don't want to come up on stage, that's possible, and we can translate that through Zoom. Anyone joining us on Zoom has the Q&A function on Zoom as well, and Rachel will also be able to answer questions at the end along with Rob. So a big welcome to Rachel O'Neill, who's here in person, who's holding my notes for me just off screen, and Rob, who's also on screen as well. Unfortunately, Rob couldn't be here in person in Edinburgh, that was the plan, so he's joining us remotely. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about Rachel. Rachel O'Neill is a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh in deaf education and is based in Murray House. Rachel has also taught deaf children in Manchester for 25 years before she moved to Edinburgh in 2006 and has been here ever since. Her area focuses on people training to become teachers of the deaf and research in that same area. Rob Wilks, our other presenter tonight, is a qualified solicitor. He's not a practicing solicitor, but he does give advice, and he works with the deaf community locally to him and is interested in equality, oppression and employment area of research. And he now lectures in professional law at Cardiff University. His interest in the research area of deaf education is evidenced in the recent publication of his that he co-authored with Rachel O'Neill. Comparing both Welsh and Gaelic with BSL language policy, and they'll tell you more about the research that they've both done this evening. He'll tell you more about the curriculum in Wales that supports BSL. So a very big warm welcome to both Rob and Rachel. Rob, I believe, is going to start the presentation and then over to Rachel, so enjoy.
Thank you, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see? Okay, is the light okay? If somebody can just indicate. I can't see anybody at the moment. Yes, okay, good. I have an indication that I can be seen. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Rob Wilks. And I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person in Edinburgh this evening. I've got quite a bad cold and cough. So I didn't want to bring my Welsh germs to Scotland. I thought it was better to stay at home. And luckily, because of the wonders of technology, I'm able to join you online. So the title of our presentation today is Betting on Deaf Children's Futures, and how far the Scottish and Welsh approaches have gone to ensuring the inclusion of BSL in deaf education. And this is a project that Rachel O'Neill and I have worked on for a few years now. We've just recently published the second report, the second phase of our report, in October of this year. So we'll be talking through what research we've done and the recommendations we've made. As you'll be aware, any academic study must start with a research question, and you can see here my research question in terms of how the approach of the devolved administrations of Scotland and Wales to language planning actually support the promotion and encouragement of BSL in deaf education. So this is our main research question, but we also have a few sub-questions. And these sub-questions are as follows. What approaches do Scotland and Wales take to language planning? How do key stakeholders in Scotland and Wales conceptualise BSL in terms of deaf, disabled and language minority rights? I.e., whether they would perceive deaf people more under disability frameworks or under language minority frameworks and language rights frameworks. So this sub-question actually explores that conceptualisation. And finally, to what extent does the deaf-disabled paradigm persist in Scotland and Wales in the context of deaf education? And the final sub-question is, what role do national bodies and local authorities and parents of deaf children have in relation to deaf children's use of BSL and bilingual potential? So our presentation today will seek to answer these questions, so we'll revisit these questions at the end of the presentation once we've given you some more detail of what we found. So to give you some background of our research project, this was conducted over 2 phases. The first was essentially desk research, so Rachel and I reviewed various documents, BSL plans, both nationally and locally, with a focus obviously on Scotland. We also looked at a deaf teachers group chat history to try and identify issues in relation to deaf education. And the phase 1 report was published in November 2021. And one of the main themes that we identified was that there was a very binary attitude towards BSL and English in these documents or by deaf teachers in deaf teacher chat. It's always an either or, either BSL or English, but never both together. Another thing that we discovered was that deaf teachers actually struggle to get qualified as teachers. And overall, this led to 14 recommendations in the report. So one of the clear recommendations we made was that we need more discussion, more debate about language attitudes, about bilingualism for deaf children and issues in deaf education. We need more BSL tutors. That's just a brief touchstone, if you like, of some of the recommendations that we've made. With regards to phase 2, we focused on key themes that we had identified in phase 1 and conducted more in-depth examination of those themes. We particularly focused on whether the conceptualisation of BSL as a language was prevalent amongst people, and we did this through 18 interviews with 21 stakeholders. So we did interviews in the second phase as opposed to doing desk-based research in the first phase. With these interviews, sometimes we had more than one person from one organisation in the interview, so that's why we had 21 stakeholders but only 18 interviews conducted. And these were with people in Wales and in Scotland, in government, national public bodies, local authorities, schools, colleges, universities and the third sector. In phase 1 we only focused on Scotland, but phase 2 was when we decided to do a comparison between Scotland and Wales, because as you know, Scotland has its own BSL Scotland Act, but Wales actually has BSL named in its language curriculum, in its curriculum for Wales. So each country has a slightly different approach to the recognition of BSL. Because Wales doesn't have its own BSL Act as yet, we were interested to see if there was a difference in approach, in the perception, when one country has a legal act and the other has the language mentioned in its curriculum. So as I said, the second phase report was published in October of 2022. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the education systems of Scotland and Wales. In Scotland, the key principle for deaf children is that they will be mainstreamed. There are no deaf schools. So there's an assumption that as soon as a deaf child enters the education system, they will be mainstreamed. But when we compare to Gaelic language influences, this isn't the same system. Parents can request that their child goes into a Gaelic medium education school, even if they're out of catchment, and the government or the council has to provide that. When we consider the number of teachers of the deaf in Scotland, there are 132 who are in positions of full-time equivalent to 132 teacher of the deaf positions. 68% have been trained, 27% are in training, and 5% are untrained. And this is according to the CRIDE report from 2021. In Scotland there are 14 resource bases and 3 small schools for deaf children. And in Scotland the relevant public bodies include the Care Inspectorate, the Scottish Qualifications Authority, the General Teaching Council of Scotland and Education Scotland. So these are the most relevant stakeholder public bodies. Now when we consider the Welsh situation, deaf children are also mainstreamed. However, in Wales there is a philosophy of bilingualism in all schools, so all children must learn English and Welsh throughout their schooling. So this does mean that all hearing children learn Welsh. Some deaf children do. There's a bit of a mixed sort of variation as to whether deaf children are exposed to Welsh from a young age, but it's definitely part of the curriculum. So parents also can select for their children to attend a Welsh medium school or an English medium school, depending on where they live, but if they're in an English medium school, they'll still learn Welsh. To compare the numbers of teachers of the deaf, we mentioned that in Scotland there are 132 full-time equivalents. In Wales there are only 60, so less than half the number that we have in Scotland. And there are 20 resource bases. When we consider the relevant public bodies, they're similar. We have Social Care Wales, Qualifications Wales, and the Education Workforce Council. So now I've given you that brief overview, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail now about Scotland and Wales so that you get a better sense of the situation in each country. All of you, I'm sure, will be aware of the BSL Scotland Act, the aims of which are to promote the use of and understanding of British Sign Language. And the British Sign Language Scotland Act actually requires the Scottish Government to prepare and publish a national plan in relation to BSL, which sets out their BSL strategy. also requires public authorities to prepare and publish their own BSL plans and set out measures to be taken in relation to the use of BSL within their plan. The Scottish Government is required to publish their national plan every 6 years. And despite the fact that there is a BSL Scotland Act, it doesn't actually explicitly say that deaf children have the right to access BSL or be exposed to BSL from a young age in education, even though this was a concern of many deaf campaigners and what the deaf community wanted to see in the BSL Act. Because this inclusion would have led to significant improvements in deaf education, but unfortunately this did not appear in the final version of the Act. But because local authorities are responsible for education and they have an authority, if you like, or a requirement to promote BSL, it's almost like an indirect way of ensuring, in theory, that deaf children can have exposure to BSL throughout their education. So when we consider the Scottish National BSL Plan, the current plan is from 2017 until 2023, after which there'll be a new plan disseminated. And I'm going to highlight here for you some of the key goals related to deaf education that are outlined in the plan. Goals 10 to 13 focus on early family resources in BSL. So this is when a child is diagnosed with deafness, then the family can access and learn BSL. That GTCs should remove barriers for BSL users to become registered teachers. That Education Scotland should lead on work with parents who use BSL so that they can get involved in their children's learning. Another goal is that Scottish ministers should look into the level of BSL held by teachers and support staff of deaf children in schools, and that the Scottish Qualifications Authority should develop an initial suite of awards in BSL. Another goal is that Scotland's National Centre for Languages should lead the work in support of BSL learning for hearing pupils. And the Scottish Funding Council should support colleges and universities in developing BSL plans. And finally, the Student Award Agency Scotland should offer accessible advice and guidance to students who use BSL. So basically making sure that information is available to them in BSL about what they can access through SAS. So now when we highlight which goals have been successfully achieved, which are ongoing or still on the way to being achieved. So those where we've seen no movement at all are highlighted in red. The goals highlighted in amber, we've seen some progress, and those in green, we can state categorically that there has been some achievement of those goals. So there are two goals which are still outlined in red. The first is the early family resources in BSL, which we've not seen any development of as yet. And the other is for the Scottish Government to look into the level of BSL held by teachers and support staff to support deaf education. We've not seen any progress in this area as yet. There has, however, been some progress for those goals highlighted in amber. So GTCs have removed barriers for BSL users to become registered teachers, and we've also seen guidance provided by SAS for potential students in BSL. The Scottish Funding Council, the Scottish Qualifications Authority and the Scottish National Centre for Languages have all achieved their goals as outlined here in this list, and Education Scotland has also led work with parents. So we have seen some significant achievements within the BSL plan with regards to deaf education. Now, Education Scotland has the remit to develop the curriculum for excellence. And this curriculum for excellence outlines what all schools have to follow in terms of delivery of subjects, courses, etc. to children throughout their schooling. So there are 4 capacities outlined in this curriculum for excellence. And this basically means these are the capacities that every child is expected to be able to achieve, to develop confidence, and to be responsible citizens and effective contributors to society. So these are these capacities that are outlined in the curriculum for excellence. So obviously there are 3 core subjects that we would all expect: literacy, numeracy, health and well-being. And every child is expected to develop an understanding, skills and knowledge in these subjects. As I said, that literacy, numeracy and health and well-being. And what we're interested here specifically for our purposes in thinking about deaf education is the language component, the literacy component, and the fact that we have languages outlined in the curriculum for excellence where they talk about the 1+2 approach, L1, L2, L3. At the moment, what's recognised is whether people what language people speak at home. For their L2, their second language, they're allowed to choose from 8 different languages, and their third language, they can choose an additional second language subject to availability in their school, and technically this can include BSL. But the problem we find at the moment is that there aren't enough BSL teachers necessarily to meet this demand. So I've just given you an overview of the situation here in Scotland. So we have to consider what's next. We expect that the Scottish Government soon will be consulting on competencies for teachers of the deaf, so this is some progress, again, towards the goals of the National Plan. There will be a second BSL National Plan, and we are hoping that we'll be able to provide some of our findings, which might bring more focus on deaf education, and especially the early years focus, and BSL being used in the classroom up to the age of 5. And we're hoping that some of our findings will influence the inclusion of that information in the new BSL plan. Because BSL in the classroom is actually an essential component, and that's what's currently missing from the national plan. There will be the validation of a new degree in primary education and BSL with a start date of September 2024 at the University of Edinburgh, which again is significant progress. The Scottish Deaf Teachers Group will be holding further talks with the GTCs, General Teaching Councils in Scotland. At the moment, Dr. Audrey Cameron has been working on the BSL glossary, and this has been expanding rapidly, and we see a lot more potential there for curriculum support. And finally, the existing BSL unit qualification under the Scottish Qualifications Authority can become a National 5 and higher qualification once there are more qualified teachers to actually teach BSL in schools. So moving on from Scotland, let's give some consideration for the Welsh situation. As yet, there is not yet a BSL Act for Wales, or despite the fact this has been campaigned for since 1999. DEFO, which was a deaf youth forum in Wales, actually submitted a petition to the Senedd in 2019. And the Senedd is essentially the Welsh Parliament. And the petition was requesting improved access to education and services for deaf children. Although this was successfully received by the Senedd, no further action was taken. A motion was then submitted to the Senedd by Mark Isherwood, who was a member of the Senedd, and this was passed in February 2021. And this was, as I said, passed in the Senedd, but unfortunately it relied on going through a private members ballot, whether it would be taken to the next stage and be discussed in Parliament, and unfortunately that's not yet been picked up through a private member's bill. There was another motion passed by the Senate in December 2022, so just a couple of weeks ago. And this again was in relation to a BSL bill, and recommended there should be a BSL commissioner with the aim of improving access to education in BSL. And again, this motion passed. But nothing can happen without the Welsh Government actually providing support. So Jane Hutt, who's the Minister for Social Justice in the Welsh Senate, said that she has been waiting for the British Deaf Association to complete their BSL audit. And that should be published in January 2023, hopefully. And once that is available, the Welsh Government will then ask the Disability Rights Task Force to look at the recommendations from that BSL audit, which are likely to include the recommendation for a BSL Act in Wales. And so their stance is that if there are recommendations that will support this process, it's much more likely to be taken up and taken forward. So we'll keep our eyes open for that in January, hopefully. The curriculum for Wales was introduced in September 2022, so it's a new curriculum and it's going to be phased in over time to different year groups. So the primary age group have already been introduced to the new curriculum. And it's quite similar to the curriculum for excellence that you have in Scotland. And there's a person, I can't remember their name right now, but led the curriculum for excellence development, who was also involved in consulting for the curriculum in Wales. There are 4 purposes that guide the whole of the curriculum. If you remember, I mentioned the 4 capacities that were outlined in the Scottish curriculum for excellence. So this, in the Welsh curriculum, they're referred to as the 4 purposes. There are 6 areas of learning and experience, including things like communication, literacy, and so on and so forth. But one of the things we see in the curriculum for Wales is that there's some more flexibility. The Welsh Government didn't want to be as prescriptive about what should be covered. They wanted to give schools the autonomy and discretion to be able to decide how to deliver the curriculum, as long as they could demonstrate that they were meeting the 6 areas of learning and experience, then it was up to the teachers to decide how to provide the curriculum. But so they refer to this as a co-constructed curriculum, where they embed both English and Welsh throughout the curriculum. And both these languages are treated equally in the curriculum. And they also recognise various international languages, in the same way that the Scottish curriculum has the 1+2 languages ideology. In the curriculum for Wales, they talk about English and Welsh, and all other languages are referred to as international languages, including BSL.
I don't know if Zoom people can even see me.
Okay, sorry about that, I'm not quite sure what happened. So as I was saying, English and Welsh are treated equally in the curriculum, but the curriculum also recognises all other languages and regards them as international languages, including British Sign Language. So it's interesting that the curriculum for Wales incorporates a lot more linguistics. They talk much more about languages, different languages, English, Welsh, other languages, translanguaging strategies. The Welsh Government have set up a BSL glossary group to hold various focus groups to discuss how different jargons can be translated into BSL and make them available for deaf BSL users through processes of feedback, and Scottish Sensory Centre have been involved in that BSL glossary process as well. So when we consider what's next for Wales, as I mentioned already, we're waiting for the BDA's BSL audit that will be available in January 2023. The Welsh Government have employed a new BSL policy manager. So once the BSL audit is published, this policy manager will be able to base their workplace recommendations on this audit report. And I mentioned earlier on as well, the Disability Task Force will be considering the findings of the audit report and putting forward recommendations to the Welsh Government. So we're hoping this will have BSL representation, deaf representation in the task force as well going forward. There's work underway to develop resources in BSL. There's the Curriculum for Wales team, the BSL glossary team, and the Deafness, Cognition and Language Centre at UCL in London are all doing a lot of work to develop resources in this area. Unfortunately, like Scotland, we don't have enough BSL teachers, qualified BSL teachers in Wales. So we want to work with the education workforce to try and determine how we can increase the numbers of qualified BSL teachers. Another issue in Wales is that there are no universities that offer teacher training courses that include BSL or offer any BSL courses at any level in Wales. So if we can compare the fact that it's possible to get an education in Welsh medium schools, be immersed in Welsh speaking environments, both in schools and in bilingual Welsh English speaking universities, we don't have the equivalents in BSL. There are no BSL qualifications available through any university in Wales. Everybody has to go to England to get those qualifications. So that's all from me, and now I'm going to hand over Rachel to talk about the Phase 2 report.
Hello everyone, can you see me okay from there? So Rob, if you can forward on the slides, that'd be great. Okay. So let me explain a little bit more about what we wanted to achieve from part 2 of the report. Having read the literature review, and as you can see in the slides here, the ones that we did look at, if we talk about language planning, and being able to look at the differences between Scotland and Wales and the different approaches that they take to their language planning and the language ideologies, what we found was in Scotland, the approach with Gaelic and the approach in Wales with Welsh, we were interested in how the government ran both of these additional languages. So some of the areas we looked at in our literature review was language acquisition, language planning, deaf education, also bilingual education. We were interested in translanguaging and also that immersion and education of BSL, because for often, we'll see deaf people here who maybe start signing and then they'll maybe switch into English for their friends, or they're maybe speaking but they'll fingerspell something, And so that notion of translanguaging, where you use different communication strategies in both BSL and English, happens. And it happens in schools, it happens in classrooms as well, where teachers will use strategies in translanguaging to get their point across. They may sign, they may use speech, and a mixture of both modes. What was really interesting was in the Welsh curriculum, there's actual mention of translanguaging within the curriculum for Wales. So some of the other literature review we looked at was more ideological around the language attitudes to deaf education. So Rob and I decided for the second phase of our research to interview people, and we wanted to find examples both in Wales and in Scotland to allow for comparison. And these are the different categories of people that we interviewed. We wanted to talk to civil servants, the people who were in charge in the government, both in Wales and in Scotland. So we interviewed one of each. We also interviewed colleges and university representatives, one from Scotland, one from Wales. Councils were only in Scotland. We spoke to local authorities here in Scotland, and those responsible for deaf children's education. And when it came to national public bodies, we felt it was important to speak to them because, especially in Scotland, they have responsibility under the BSL Act, so they have to create their own national BSL plans. So we chose 3 of those to interview. We also wanted to get the views of teachers of the deaf. So we interviewed 2 from Scotland and 2 from Wales, you know, what people are doing on the ground. And from voluntary groups as well, third sector organisations, we were interested in what their views were both in Scotland and in Wales. So you can see the total there that we had 11 people from Scotland that we interviewed, and in Wales that was 8. And so sometimes organisations represented both, maybe they were based, you know, both in Scotland and in Wales, so we just invited them for one group interview. The interviews happened both in sign language and in speech, and we transcribed all of our data, translated it where we had to, and thought, well, how do we interpret these findings? So Rob and I, because we obviously both work in Scotland and in Wales, we looked at the data and we thought, how do we identify the themes that are here, you know, from these 2 different areas? It could be very different. Next slide, please. And so we created this. The image you can see on screen is our theme map, and I'll have to stand a bit closer just to see it at the start.
Okay, I'll see me still.
Mm-hmm. So I'm old, I have to stand closer to the screen, sorry. Hope everyone can still see me. So we wanted to find a different way of displaying that, and we thought, what do people think about BSL as a language? So here's the themes that we found. There's very many viewpoints that contribute to people's views on BSL as a language. So there are multiple viewpoints in intersectionality, and deaf community input was very strong on both the BSL Act and from deaf organisations. We also found there was a strong influence from medical sector and health care influence, so that focus on hearing aids and cochlear implants and medical interventions to deafness. And what we did notice was that actually viewpoints were often quite binary. It was you sign or you speak, you know, and we're seen as really operating in 2 different worlds. There wasn't many people who thought that you could have both, provision of both a bilingual approach. And we thought, well, how does the Welsh government deal with Welsh, and how does the Scottish government deal with Gaelic? Because it should be a similar approach to BSL, it's another language that's available to children. What we noticed was that the Welsh government have significant funding and training for teachers. There's a funding stream that's committed to Welsh-speaking teachers. And there's also support for early years and new roles in both Gaelic and in Welsh. There's also, around Gaelic and Welsh, a lot more persuading and encouraging that happens with parents of children to speak both Gaelic and Welsh. And so there's more support for community groups, things like play groups, and these things are government funded. And we see Welsh as well, particularly embedded in the national curriculum. So there's evidence there. And we see that there's a Gaelic medium curriculum as well. When we consider BSL though, it's a very different story. Bilingual teaching and training for teachers doesn't exist in BSL. There isn't the bilingual course available. There isn't the early years jobs. It's not supported in terms of working with families or at the early years. In terms of encouraging parents to try BSL and playgroups, nothing exists. And so the policy says that people should be able to make an informed choice, but the choice isn't there on the ground, it's not there in the grassroots for people to really take that choice. So we see a very different approach from Gaelic and BSL in Scotland and Welsh and BSL. We do see some similarities in terms of these minority languages. So in terms of, Wales and Scotland, we are both situated in large areas. We have larger rural areas and some areas in the city. So we have, maybe Welsh speakers out in a rurality, same as we have with Gaelic or a sign language user who might be off on an island. So our geography is similar. Gaelic does experience the same problem as we see in BSL with trying to attract more staff who are fluent Gaelic speakers, particularly getting the right early years staff. They struggle to get people who are qualified who can teach in nursery. And in terms of materials and resources, we also see the same challenges for both Gaelic teachers. Say the same, we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough materials, there's nothing printed, we don't have anything that's our own. So we do see similarities around these minority languages with BSL, but there's some unique differences. Okay, this is bigger, I can see that now. So to summarise our findings from this phase 2 of the report, we realise that the influence from the medical sector is extremely powerful. There's a lot of influence on families, it affects teachers, it affects local authorities and how people conceptualise working with deaf children. It really influences into family life as well, in terms of, Cochlear Implant Centre saying not to sign with deaf children, and we see that influence also in classrooms where BSL is not encouraged either. The second finding I want to talk about is in terms of resources, and we're talking about money and funding that just does not exist. When the BSL Act was first passed in 2015, I remember they said then, there's no money for this. And we do need funding to support this resource development, to support schools. We need money to pay for teachers, so both curriculum development and staffing in bilingualism. Third finding there is around the need for more training in particularly how to teach children bilingually and how to teach through BSL. At the moment, we haven't even started that. Scotland and Wales are in the same position. We haven't got enough training in language pedagogy for deaf children. And another finding that was very important, I think, is that fantastic example that you see in Wales and in Scotland, is that early years support for the family, where they want them to become bilingual. And that was great to see that there's that development there. That charities, voluntary organisations and government support that, especially in Wales, the playgroups, particularly in the younger and the early years, there is support. But we did find that there's actually a huge gap when we interviewed people, and it's that age of 0 to 3. Nobody had any idea of what to do with deaf children at that age. How do you teach a hearing family sign language when you have one deaf child in a hearing home? What about nursery? Where's the BSL support at nursery? BSL teachers may need to visit the home, and yet when we interviewed people about what they do, what the services are, what provision is, there's no infrastructure, there's no system, there's nothing. So this example image of a word cloud, here you can see on screen, you can see how strong that medical influence, those medical words are on our work. Diagnosis, and that they often talk about deafness being a diagnosis. Sign dependent, again with that negative connotation and pity about breaking the news of when someone's born deaf and telling the parents that they're deaf. Is breaking the news, again, is breaking bad news. Nobody talks about breaking good news. It's not a positive thing ever. So again, it's this negative connotation about an impairment. One term that I really don't like is comorbidities. Again, that's a hugely medical term that means additional needs, maybe autism or physical disability, and it's usually, I don't like that word morbidity because it includes morbid there. So again, that relationship to a negative connotation and death. We see things there like needs. What about needs? It's not needs. They don't need sign. So just as an example, you can see these terms, and these have a huge influence at all levels of a deaf child's education. And this starts at birth. It starts from the cochlear implant centre. It starts in hospitals. There are other words available. They don't have to use these, but that's what we see most commonly. So returning to our research questions for this phase of the study. We were keen to explore how that approach of devolved administrations of both Scotland and Wales, how their approach to language planning supported that promotion and encouragement of BSL in deaf education. So, the feedback in some of our views I'll give you at the end. You can see the green there is kind of our views and our response to these questions from our findings. In terms of approaches, we found that they were varied and successful in terms of other minority languages like Welsh and Gaelic, not necessarily in terms of BSL. We know how people view sign and how they conceptualise BSL. And we saw that it's conceptualised medically as an impairment with, negative connotations, and we didn't see a lot of positive talk around language minority rights. Often it was much more in terms of deaf disabled. And we saw that teachers of the deaf had very little confidence in teaching in BSL in terms of using bilingualism. And again, this very negative view is dominant. This viewpoint that deaf disabled as the paradigm does persist in both Scotland and Wales. In terms of the national bodies, we found that there was influence there, and it was important that that existed in a strategic way, but it didn't yet happen on the ground in deaf educational settings. So there's three areas, again, to summarise how our recommendations are framed around early years, particularly. We want to learn from the Curriculum for Wales and their approach to Welsh bilingualism, particularly for things like playgroups. And the TOOF playgroup, you see there, that TOOF model, means 2 languages from the start. So that health visitor who's visiting a mum with a newborn baby says, would you like to think about bilingualism for your child? A bilingual approach to education. They're given information at the health visitor stage. Come to our bilingual playgroup. That's all available. And it's a really successful project in Wales. The first few years they're exposed to bilingualism. We also recommend that there should be much more funding for nursery workers, for those early years care service workers, to improve their signing skills so that they are fluent BSL users. And again, looking at that Welsh example where it's government funded playgroups, So the government in Wales funds this to have, Welsh speaking led playgroups and nurseries where it's led by Welsh speakers themselves. And so could that kind of thing exist in Scotland, where it would be a BSL medium nursery? It's a really important time, that 0 to 5, for children to acquire a language. So if they had a BSL medium nursery where they were exposed to and receiving BSL from age 0, that would be informed choice. And maybe we need to consider a new job description, a new role, where a nursery worker may be peripatetic and they may visit families in their own home, in their context, and provide BSL, to use BSL with the parents. We also need more BSL teachers to teach the parents. The second area of recommendations is around resources and resourcing for this area. We need to find out where the BSL tutors are and how many BSL tutors we have, both in Scotland and in Wales. There's ABSLTA, the Association of BSL Teachers, and I know that they know some of that from their survey, but we need to get exact numbers in both Scotland and in Wales. It would be nice to have far more qualified teachers working in schools, but maybe we also need to accredit tutors to work in schools and to have them as qualified individuals. We do need that BSL degree. Wales needs a BSL degree available for teachers. Scotland is developing that. We're halfway there, I think. We've got a primary school teaching degree in BSL that's going to hopefully be established in 2024. And I think Wales realises that the Welsh-speaking teachers of the deaf there need training to become teachers of the deaf, because I think there's only one person who is a teacher of the deaf who actually speaks Welsh themselves. And my understanding is that Rob mentioned from the PGCE course, the PGCE course that's available for people to become teachers. It's a 1-year course, and that could be established in Wales. That would allow us to have more BSL teachers. But people would need to have a degree first, and so if we did have that, it could be established in Wales. Now, another interesting finding, in Wales, and in Gaelic actually as well, in Welsh-speaking area, then people are paid to take time off and to improve their language skills in both spoken Welsh and spoken Gaelic. 1 year, full time, still paid as a teacher, they take a language sabbatical. Now that doesn't exist in BSL, but could you imagine if we had people going on a BSL language sabbatical? That would hugely raise the levels. That would be so positive for the levels of BSL that people have. So, in summary, you'll be aware the title of our talk is Betting on Deaf Children's Futures. We went back and forth with some discussions around the title for this talk. I don't like that idea of betting on futures, because that suggests that there's only one way, and actually there's plenty of choice of what would be the right way to educate deaf children. This image, I think, is particularly powerful. It shows the situation we're in just now. It's a dull, grey field. Things are not happening. It doesn't look very positive. Expectations are low. Expectations and achievement are low for deaf children. But the door is open, and we can see green hills, blue sky, far more potential through that door. And the governments of both Wales and Scotland could choose to go through that door. They can open that door and offer that green field and blue skies for deaf children, but it's up to the governments. that's the end of our talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Rob and Rachel for your brilliant presentation. So we're going to have a 15-minute break. Come back at 10 past. 15-minute break. And come back at 10 past 7. So please do order some pizza. Not for the audience on Zoom, unfortunately, but those who are here in person in Deaf Action, feel free to get yourself some pizza, and then we'll come back and have some Q&A time when we all come back. Thank you.
Everyone. Hello. Can I have everyone's attention, please? Certainly everyone who's in the room, anyway. For those of you who are on Zoom, you can type your questions into the Q&A box. And we will check that and see what questions we've got there. If you're in the room, you have got the giant yellow post-its. If you've written any questions there, you can pass them to me, or you can come up and ask them at the front. And I'll give a translation. And we have Rob and Rachel who can hopefully answer those questions. Do we have anyone in the room? Can you show me that? So if you're happy to sign your question, please feel free to come up. But if you... Okay, can everybody see okay? So on screen we should have Rob and also whoever's on stage. Okay, so we'll get you first. We're just discussing in the room what that's going to look like. Okay, do you have a question? I have to kind of stand down here, don't I, so that everyone can see me. Hello everyone, I hope you can see me on Zoom. Nice to see you, Rob. Great presentation. Sparked off a few things for me, a couple of questions. My first one is, when we're talking about the Scottish Government National Plan and the steps that are in there, the actions, I noticed that you had the traffic light system there, which I thought was interesting. The amber ones was around GTCS, about removing barriers for deaf teachers, deaf people to become qualified teachers. And that one's at amber. So I wondered, was that amber status, was that author opinion, or do GTCS consider that complete? So that's my first question, is how did it get its amber status? Where does that perception come from? My second question is around the recommendations. I thought that was great, that you made that recommendation around nurseries, that people must be fluent BSL users in nurseries. You know, that was underlined and that caught my eye. I think that's a really specific one, because in terms of, you know, someone who sees that and says, oh, you use BSL, yeah, I've got level 2, that's good enough, and you're saying, no, it must be level 6 with 5 years maximum fluency, that means fluency. So what's your definition of fluency? I think saying fluency could be kind of vague, so if you can clarify that. Thanks, Gordon. Rob, do you want to answer that question, or will it be Rachel? So maybe Rachel can respond to the first question and I'll respond to the second. So GTCS. Rob and I decided to allocate that an orange status because one of their report, in part one of our report, we noted that there had been discussions with GTCS. And with our deaf teachers group and our discussions with them, we noticed that there needs to be improvement on the support for deaf teachers, because when they finish their course and then they go into that probationary year, they work for a year in schools, there's a number of barriers that they experience when they're out on their probationary year. And GTCS have listened well to us, but they're thinking about that potential for deaf teachers to go into a resource base, a specific, like where they have a small deaf school, or it's a deaf resource base next to a hearing school. So we feel like we're making progress in some areas, but we're not there yet. So that's why it's amber.
So I'll go on and respond to the second question. Yeah, please do. Go ahead, Rob. So Gordon asked about how we define fluency and how fluent is fluent, if you like. And when we consider the early years, essentially what we would like to see is that people are fluent enough to be able to communicate with a young child, seem to be one step ahead of them. So if you're thinking of children who are aged 0 to 3, they're not going to have a high level of fluency themselves yet at that age. They're starting to acquire language. So any teachers or support workers need to be one step ahead of those children. You need to have a level of fluency that is higher than those children. So whether it was English or BSL, it's the same principle. But the level of fluency could be focused around, can you do baby talk, can you do sort of childhood discourse, and then if you're talking to adults, then it's a different kind of fluency that's expected. So whether it's English, whether it's BSL, the principles are the same. And I think that's a good question. We could refer to level 1, level 2, level 3 qualifications, but I think that's a little bit too prescriptive. What we really should be saying is that the minimum level of fluency should be at least one step above the fluency or the language abilities of the children being interacted with. I don't know if Rachel wants to add anything else to that, but that's my take on it.
Okay, thanks, Rob. We have more questions. Someone in the room has asked around the recommendations. And who are the recommendations for? And does Rob or Rachel want to respond to that?
Yep, I don't mind, I'll respond to that. The recommendations essentially are for the governments in Wales and Scotland. Some are more specific to the Welsh context. So, for example, the BSL policy manager that's been recruited to the Welsh Government, that's something that we were able to influence because of our recommendations and through our involvement in various meetings, representation to the Welsh Government, and saying how important it would be for a BSL officer to be placed within the government to promote the idea of the use of BSL in schools, in medical services and so on. And her name, the BSL policy officer's name is Suki, and so she has helped us reach out and disseminate our findings, and so she's listening to us and taking on board our recommendations. So we think that by working with her, we'll be able to make things happen. And we're trying to do the same thing in Scotland, but there are slightly different ways of going about it. Because we've obviously got the next BSL plan that will be developed, and that's where we feel that we can have the most influence to influence what will be included in the next BSL plan.
Rachel, did you want to add to that response? Absolutely, it's the same story here. Rob has so much energy to attend all these meetings and meet people, it's fantastic. So he has set up a lot of different meetings, and we've got more from January onwards with government officials. We're meeting with Education Scotland, we're meeting with SILT, which is Scotland's National Centre for Languages. So there's going to be a whole load of meetings, and I'm just going to trail behind Rob and follow him. So we have more questions from the room. Someone's asking, who is funding deaf people to become BSL tutors? Who will fund that? Who'd like to respond there? Rob? Rachel? Rachel, if you go first. So I think there's two issues related to that. People who want to become qualified school teachers, there is a pathway that is being developed. But people who would like to become BSL tutors and, for example, work with families or work with, in a community centre or work for a council and provide teaching in a classroom, but there might not be courses available for them to teach. So we do need more, community courses available, and so government funding would help tutors there. But another thing we need to look at is, a new profession of nursery workers who are fluent BSL users and who are deaf people themselves.
And if I could just add to what Rachel just said, I think really the best way forward would be to think about making sure that training is available for BSL tutors and for teachers, and we need to make funding available, because people can't proceed unless they can access funding. Anybody who goes to university needs to access funding, but unfortunately there's a gap in terms of the funding available for BSL tutors specifically. So we know there are universities like UCLan in Preston, Wolverhampton, Heriot Watts, York St John. So there are key universities where courses are provided in deaf studies or BSL interpreting, but we need something for BSL tutors, people to become qualified as tutors in BSL, so that we can develop courses in learning language, learning how to teach language, in the same way that anyone wants to become a qualified teacher of the deaf, or a qualified teacher, you can go do a general degree and then you go on and do a postgraduate certificate in education. So it's the same kind of principle. Could we encourage people to study BSL as a degree and then go on and become a qualified teacher of that language? So we need to see more qualifications for people in BSL about BSL. So the key point here is that we also need to consider further education, because that's where early years workers qualify. They'll go do courses in further education rather than higher education. So we also need to make sure that there's funding available for those courses to be developed and offered, delivered in further education colleges as well as in higher education. Any other questions? Okay, so we have the first question written down here. The first question asks whether the recommendations that you've come up with have actually been disseminated or presented to different organisations and what their responses have been to the recommendations. Rob, Rachel, either of you would like to respond? Rachel? Okay, Rachel's going to respond to that question.
So part one of our research, the phase one that we completed in 2021, we did publish that report. It's available on our website. It was disseminated, and we had organisational meetings. And at the same time, the government had the review of the national plan that was taking place around the same time. And so we explained our findings from part one of the research. The report went out. So we had the template, and we commented on all the template, with all the councils used the same template all over Scotland, and we said, well look, this looks the same everywhere, but you're all missing what happens in the classroom in schools. Every one of your BSL plans is too similar. And they realised that actually these language bases and the teachers and councils were quite embarrassed by the results of our first report. So that's where we realised, okay, this next time in phase two, we better focus more on the language education. Rob, do you want to add?
Yeah, just to add, with respect to the Welsh situation, Suki, who I mentioned earlier, the new BSL policy manager in the Welsh Government, said that she had read our report, and I asked her which recommendations she would like to proceed with, and she said all of them. So fantastic. That's a good start. That's a good starting point. So she obviously is not responsible for everything that the government can do. She can't force different parts of the government to implement all of the recommendations, but she's supportive of them and wants to see more progress towards achieving them. So that's a really good start. Okay, we have another question written down here.
Have there been any discussions around trying to improve BSL, Scottish? There's very few courses around and there's no funding around. Maybe Rachel wants to answer that? Sorry, BSL tutors, to increase the numbers of BSL tutors. Not yet, but we do think that's important. We know that BSL teachers and BSL tutors have a meeting planned up, so that's why we have Gary Quinn, we're going to meet with Gary, and I think it'll be a worthwhile and important meeting, because we know that yes, there's a degree qualification for people who want to teach qualifications in schools, so we do need registered teachers, but we also need more tutors. And so if people would like to be involved, let us know. Okay. Rob, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I'm happy to add to that. We also had a meeting with the Association of British Sign Language Tutors and Assessors. And it was really interesting, through that meeting, they said they have about 18 members, 18 members who are from Wales. 18 members altogether, and only 7 from Wales and 10 in Scotland. So the majority of the ABSLTA members are in England, and I'm not sure how many in Northern Ireland. They didn't mention specifically. So obviously, if we can see their membership figures, we see that the majority of BSL tutors are based throughout England, and so that's a real gap for us in Scotland and in Wales. So we need to establish different courses, make it easier for deaf people to become qualified BSL tutors, because this is our language, and so we want our people to be able to teach our language. So once we have more courses, we can recruit more tutors, more people will become qualified. This is the way forward for us, but we don't have a magic wand. We know it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take us a few years to really grow the numbers that we need. So just to clarify, the number there was 80 BSL tutors altogether who are registered with ABSLTA. So it seems that we have 3 questions online. Okay, I'm going to try and read this. It's quite small in the chat box. So the first question is, have you seen any progress in relation to the interaction between the deaf community and the development of BSL plans? And BSL, people who are fluent in BSL from the deaf community being involved in the development of those plans, because it seems that in England we haven't seen much involvement, for example, with the development of the BSL GCSE. So in the EHCPS, is there any possibility to make provisions for deaf people in the mainstream, in schools, including learning BSL without the need for integration? Or the Education, Health and Care Plan? Okay, this is a challenging question to answer. I think it's still very early days at the moment. We need to really sort out the need for more courses first, more people learning how to teach BSL. So we need to really figure out how people teach, how they learn BSL. We need to encourage people to mix with the deaf community, going to deaf clubs, working with deaf people, with deaf children. We can encourage that and then try and model what's traditionally worked in the deaf community, so that we can encourage more of that within sort of more formalised teaching programs. Okay, Rachel wants to respond as well about the EHCP.
So in Scotland we have an ECP, the ICP, an Individual Learners Plan, an ILP, and there's very few deaf children who have a different plan. So in England, everyone has their own plan, and it's called an EHCP, which is an Education, Health and Care Plan. So the system in England is that it can be written to great detail. For example, if you say, I want to have a level 3 minimum communication support worker with me, for example, or the number of hours that you want provided, you can detail that in the EHCP plan. If you say you want to have a BSL tutor, whatever that child needs, they want to achieve a level 3 certificate, that's the level of detail that can be in those plans in England. That doesn't exist in Scotland. It's not clear enough, and it's a much more vague document in Scotland. And so there is an ESP, but it's very rare for deaf children in Scotland to have one. So that's the difference. It's a policy document. In England it works well and it's very specific. It doesn't exist in Scotland, unfortunately. So Rob, if you can have a look at the other questions in the chat and see which one you'd like to answer next, if you can sign us the question and then the response.
Okay, there are 3 more questions. The first one is from Lucy, who asks about the fact that we have BSL in the curriculum for Wales, but we don't have a BSL Act in Wales. So she asks, which is most effective, having an Act or having the language mentioned in the national curriculum? And that's an interesting question, because don't forget, Scotland, although we have a BSL Act in Scotland, BSL is not actually mentioned in the Curriculum for Excellence. And you can include BSL in the curriculum. It's not excluded, but it's not specifically, explicitly mentioned in the curriculum, whereas in Wales it's very explicit that BSL is part of the national curriculum. It's still an option, and it's regarded only as an international language, not as a national language, but it is available and it's mentioned specifically. But teachers themselves can decide whether they want to teach BSL if they have the resources, the knowledge, the expertise and so on, but it's not a requirement. So to say which is better, the Act or the curriculum, having an Act or a curriculum, I'm not sure. I think we need to see how things progress in both countries, because we know, having the Act in Scotland, we haven't seen huge positive impact on deaf education as yet. The curriculum in Wales is very new, probably too early to say. But I think at the end of the day, I would say probably both are as effective as each other, because there are different ways of implementing and reinforcing the need for BSL in the curriculum. Rachel just said, good job, move on to the next question. So the next question is from someone called Louise. She asks about the fact that we've said we need more teachers of the deaf and we need to improve more fluency of people who work with in early years. So she's asking about how we can recruit more deaf people to work with children in those contexts rather than hearing people and then having to work up their BSL fluency when deaf people are already fluent.
And I think Rob's already answered this in a previous answer. But again, there does need to be more of a focus on FE and colleges, because that's where nursery workers train. So there needs to be more funding and resourcing to, there could be a course set up in Scotland that's BSL medium. You know, we have, for example, the City of Glasgow College that support a huge number of deaf students already. So they would be an ideal place to base that. But it is about persuading the government to fund that, you know, from Scottish Funding Council and also the City of Glasgow College to do that. I've seen it happen before. It was in the 90s and it was a very short-term course, but it was a 2-year course that was set up in FE. There was 30 people qualified through it. It was really successful and they went on to be in the workforce for years. Thank you, Rachel. Rob, next question.
Just to quickly add to Rachel's response to that question, of course, when it comes to whether it would be best to have deaf or hearing workers with these young children, then of course deaf people would be the best role models. But do we have enough deaf people who can teach BSL or work in those contexts? Because we need a lot more training and qualifications for BSL tutors, for deaf teachers who can use BSL. So I think in the meantime we have to accept that there will be hearing people teaching BSL in schools until we can have more deaf people who are qualified. And it's a difficult situation, it's politically sensitive, as we know. And we could insist that only deaf people could teach BSL in schools, but we can't resource that necessarily just yet, so it's a difficult one. Okay, we have one more question from Ailey. And she's referring to language pedagogy, essentially teaching somebody how to acquire a new language, so how you teach language, and whether we need to develop this area a lot further in terms of setting up courses and so on. So we know that there are courses established in Gaelic and Welsh. So we have models there for programs for how to teach Gaelic and Welsh, which could be applied to how to teach BSL in schools. Rachel, did you want to comment?
Strange, I actually do teach a course at university and it's to Gaelic teachers, and the course is called The Theory of Pedagogy in Bilingualism. In bilingual education, and I love teaching that module. It's a great course. Because in the past I taught English language, so it's very similar, but Gaelic uses that bilingualism model and that immersion model, not bilingualism, but an immersion model of bilingualism for children in schools where they speak only Gaelic, in Gaelic medium education. And then it becomes that by primary 3, primary 4, primary 5, they start to receive education in English. But most children who already have English from the home environment, because often their parents speak English at home, you know, most of them, I mean 90% of them already speak English, but their education is the immersion model at a bilingual school. And that goes well, and then they learn English later on. So we use a lot of songs, a lot of games, and you know, I don't speak Gaelic. I teach the theory of it, I don't actually teach it in Gaelic. But I think it's important to develop different ways of how to teach languages. So, you know, that immersion method is one way. There's also the translanguaging approach that we discussed earlier that we see in the Welsh language, where you mix, you know, and you maybe read English but then sign in BSL. So you maybe speak English and then are also working in translanguaging into and out of BSL, so there's plenty of ways to do that, and we do already have the theory there. It's just about establishing the courses. Thank you, Rachel. Rob, did you want to add?
Yeah, there's one more question from Fiona, who asks, how can schools in Scotland be encouraged to add BSL into their 1+2 language policy?
It's actually a success story. We do have a pack that exists in Scotland. It's called the BSL pack, and it's for teaching BSL as an L3. It was developed actually in the Highlands, and that's been disseminated to nearly all their schools. Schools up there have bought the pack. It includes signed video clips as well, and most councils really like that and enjoy it. It's taught often by teachers who don't know BSL, but they have the resource pack to support them, and that includes games, and the children seem to really enjoy it. It's a good start, but in terms of developing L1 and L2, it doesn't come under that category. It's really an L3 resource, but it's better than nothing. It's been created by a teacher themselves.
So again, it's a matter of resource development that's needed, isn't it? Yeah. There's no more questions in the chat?
Great. We have one more from in the room. Another question. Would you like to come to the front? He's coming now. Hey, Rob. So I just want to clarify. You mentioned in your slide that BSL is developed for hearing pupils, and I'd like you to tell me more about that, because I think, if BSL is achieved, then is it about, English in school being achieved for everyone and BSL being achieved for everyone? So why do you mention BSL for hearing pupils? Can you clarify that? Because if you want to start learning BSL at 0, by the time you get to primary school, you would already have BSL, so you would be the same as a hearing child who has English. So do you mean that it's about BSL being taught separately for hearing children, or being taught alongside deaf and hearing children learning BSL together? Rachel's going to respond now. I'm trying to remember the bit in the report that you're referring to, Gary. I think we were talking about L3. So L1 is your mother tongue, the one that you learn and acquire at home. L2 could be something that you learn at home, but you probably more likely learn it at school. And L3, again in terms of Scottish policy context, you learn at primary 5. So we're talking about BSL at L3 level is mostly focused on hearing pupils, but yes, of course, deaf pupils could be included. The problem that then raises, and that we brought up, was that actually what happens to L1 and L2? BSL needs to be available there for deaf children. You can't wait until it's available at L3. That's great, you have it in primary 5 for hearing pupils, but what about L1 and L2 BSL for deaf children? So yes, I completely agree with you. You're absolutely right. Rob, did you want to respond?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think you were talking about the national plan in Scotland. You're right, yes. So one of the goals in the national plan was goals 33 and 34 was for the Scottish Centre for Language Teaching to lead work on supporting BSL learning for hearing children. So that's one of the specific goals. I think that's what you're referring to. And that's an interesting one, because there does seem to have been a lot of focus in the national plan around hearing people being able to learn BSL and encouraging that, and less focus on deaf children acquiring BSL themselves. And so this really highlights who has the power in connection to deaf children, and their education. It's audiologists, it's speech therapists, it's cochlear implant medical professionals. So, as we know, 90% of deaf children are actually born to hearing parents. So they're hearing parents making decisions on their behalf with regards to their education and their language acquisition. So, in some ways, reinforcing the separation for hearing pupils learning BSL is okay, as long as it's reinforced that deaf pupils or deaf children need to be able to acquire BSL themselves from the get-go.
Any other questions in the room? We have just 15 minutes left, but I think things have quietened down on Zoom. There's no more in the chat there. So, well, thank you very much to both Rob and Rachel for their presentation tonight. Everyone in the room is sharing their thanks, and it was a great presentation. Thank you for all your responses and your questions. I have to say thank you for your time, both of you, for presenting the lecture tonight. And I can announce our next event will be in January the 17th, and I have Audrey Cameron who will, oh well, she doesn't want to be seen, but she will show you a screen where we can show you the poster of the next event. So as you can see on the screen, we will also be tweeting this. Our next event is here again at Deaf Action in the Blackwood Bar, and it will be from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. And the title of our next lecture is International Sign Unpacked. We have Dr. Annalise Kusters, who will be leading the screening of a film that we can all watch. We'll have an introduction, screen the film, and then have Q&A. There will also be popcorn if you're live in person. So please do come along. I hope to see all of you there. And in the meantime, have a lovely Christmas and enjoy the holidays. Thank you for joining us. Bye now. Bye everyone.